License and registration. You know why I pulled you over?
No, sir. My documents are in the center console. I'm reaching slowly.
Your plate's partially obstructed. Step out of the vehicle.
Understood. I do not consent to any searches.
I smell narcotics. That gives me a problem.
There is a profound fragility to power. When authority is wielded with respect and restraint, it serves as the ultimate shield for society. But when it becomes warped by unchecked assumptions and personal ego, it turns into a wildly unpredictable weapon. It takes an entire lifetime of dedication, discipline, and training to build a respectable career in public service. Yet, as we are about to see, it takes only a handful of terribly misguided decisions to completely dismantle that same career. We often talk about the law as a set of rigid rules, but at its core, the law is about human behavior. It is about boundaries. Today, we are going to explore exactly what happens when a seasoned professional who fundamentally understands those boundaries collides with someone who believes they are entirely above them. Have you ever witnessed someone stubbornly construct their own downfall, ignoring every single exit ramp along the way? Before we dive into this masterclass on constitutional rights and the devastating consequences of misjudgment, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me down in the comments where you are tuning in from. Let's unravel the story. The twilight sky was bleeding a deep, bruised purple over the vast expanses of central Texas. The oppressive summer heat clung to the cracked asphalt of a lonely rural interstate, radiating upward in shimmering waves. Cruising smoothly through this desolate landscape was a meticulously maintained late-model pickup truck. Behind the wheel sat a man who appreciated the rare, fleeting moments of absolute silence. At 42 years old, he possessed the solid, quiet demeanor of someone who carried immense responsibilities. Dressed comfortably in dark denim and a plain, unbranded cotton shirt, he appeared to be just another hard-working citizen making the long commute home. In truth, this driver was a highly decorated major serving as a specialized operative for a premier federal investigative agency within the Department of Defense. His daily reality involved dismantling complex syndicates, tracking down high-threat fugitives operating within the armed forces, and building airtight cases for federal prosecution. He was a man intimately acquainted with danger, deception, and the darkest corners of human nature. But on this particular evening, he was simply off the clock. His vehicle was locked at the precise legal speed limit. He was listening to the muted voices of a sports broadcast, letting the stress of a grueling week melt into the hum of the highway tires. He had no way of knowing that a profound test of his patience and his principles was lurking just a few miles ahead. Concealed in the deep shadows of a grassy median, a local county patrol vehicle sat idling. Inside was a deputy who viewed this specific stretch of blacktop not as a community to protect, but as a personal hunting ground. This officer was not scanning the horizon for intoxicated drivers swerving across lanes, nor was he looking to assist stranded motorists. He was actively seeking out vulnerabilities. He operated on a deeply flawed system of personal intuition, relying heavily on unfounded biases rather than tangible evidence. As the pristine pickup truck rolled past his concealed position, the deputy's gaze locked onto the vehicle. He processed the out-of-state fleet registration. He noticed the factory-standard tinted glass. And finally, as the truck passed beneath a flickering sodium street lamp, he observed the driver. Driven by rigid preconceptions, the patrolman looked at the individual behind the wheel, registered his casual attire alongside the expensive, high-end vehicle, and immediately arrived at a completely fabricated conclusion. To the deputy's skewed way of thinking, this combination did not represent a successful professional or a dedicated government servant. Instead, his flawed intuition flagged the driver as suspicious, a target ripe for a potentially lucrative asset seizure. Driven by a hunger for a high-profile bust, the deputy slammed his cruiser into gear, tearing out of the median and kicking up a massive cloud of dry earth. He aggressively closed the distance, aggressively riding the rear bumper of the pickup. This is a widely recognized psychological tactic. The goal is to induce panic, hoping the intimidated civilian will tap their brakes, swerve over the painted lines, or rapidly accelerate out of fear, providing the necessary legal justification for a traffic intervention. However, the man in the truck possessed a nervous system tempered by decades of high-stakes investigations. He glanced at his mirrors, instantly recognizing the predatory maneuvering for exactly what it was. His pulse did not quicken. He did not alter his trajectory by a single inch. He maintained his exact speed, effectively neutralizing the patrolman's aggressive posturing. Frustrated by the civilian's unflinching composure, the deputy was forced to search for an alternative justification. He scrutinized the rear of the pickup until he discovered the most trivial, heavily scrutinized loophole available in the local traffic ordinances. The plastic bracket securing the license plate, installed by the dealership itself, obscured a tiny fraction of the state emblem at the very bottom edge. It was a staggering reach, an infinitely petty technicality, but under the strict letter of the law, it provided the razor-thin margin needed to initiate an intervention. The patrolman confidently activated his emergency lights, painting the dark highway in violent flashes of crimson and blue. Inside the cabin, the federal agent allowed a quiet, deeply tired breath to escape his lungs. He did not panic. He did not frantically reach under the seats or clear the dashboard. Operating with the mechanical precision of a seasoned veteran, he activated his indicator, smoothly decelerated, and guided his heavy vehicle safely onto the wide gravel shoulder. He immediately placed the transmission into park and killed the ignition. Anticipating the tension of the impending interaction, he systematically lowered every single window in the vehicle, completely removing any shadows or visual barriers. He extracted the keys and placed them clearly on the dashboard. Finally, he rested his empty palms openly on the top of the steering wheel. He sat perfectly still, enveloped in the heavy silence of the evening, waiting for the overzealous officer to step directly into a trap constructed entirely of his own hubris. The rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on loose gravel signaled the officer's approach. He moved with a pronounced, overconfident swagger, his palm resting instinctively on his duty weapon. Adhering to fundamental protocol, he pressed his fingers against the rear taillight of the truck before arriving at the driver's side. He immediately unclipped a high-intensity illumination tool and shined the blinding beam directly into the driver's face, anticipating the frantic, nervous energy of someone with something to hide. What the light revealed instead was a breathtaking display of tactical de-escalation. The cabin was fully visible, the keys were isolated, the driver's hands were perfectly stationary and empty. To an objective observer, this was the ultimate professional courtesy, a textbook method of ensuring absolute safety and transparency. But filtered through the deputy's biased perspective, this flawless compliance was interpreted as silent arrogance. It bruised his ego. Without offering a standard greeting or identifying his jurisdiction, the deputy leaned aggressively into the threshold of the window, deliberately invading the driver's personal space. He demanded identification, registration, and proof of liability. The driver responded in a calm, resonant tone, entirely devoid of the trembling anxiety the patrolman fed upon. He clearly articulated that his credentials were in his back pocket and his paperwork was in the center compartment, explicitly narrating his intention to slowly retrieve them. This verbalization is a classic maneuver designed to eliminate any sudden movements that could be misconstrued as hostile. Using deliberate slow motions, the driver produced a standard license and handed it over. The deputy analyzed the card, using the driver's first name in a deliberate psychological attempt to establish immediate dominance. He asked if the driver understood the reason for the delay. The agent offered a single, polite negative. He did not guess. He did not apologize. He offered absolutely zero conversational leverage. When the patrolman cited the dealership bracket covering the bottom fraction of the plate as the legal basis for the stop, the driver knew instantly that it was a hollow pretext. Yet, a desolate roadside is never the proper venue to debate legal precedents. He simply acknowledged the statement with a neutral nod. The complete lack of argumentative friction deeply unsettled the patrolman. His usual script was failing to elicit a reaction. Desperate to pivot the interaction toward his ultimate goal, he began probing, casting a wide net for any inconsistency. He mockingly complimented the expensive vehicle, questioning how a man in plain clothes could afford such luxury, subtly scanning the immaculate interior for loose currency or contraband. The driver replied calmly that he was employed by the federal government. The deputy's lip curled into a skeptical sneer, his underlying bias preventing him from accepting the truth staring him in the face. He peppered the driver with rapid-fire inquiries about his destination and whether he was transporting illicit funds or narcotics. The agent responded with a singular, unwavering negative. The deputy found himself staring at an immovable object. There would be no nervous stuttering, no conflicting narratives, and certainly no voluntary surrender of constitutional rights. If the officer wanted to tear apart this vehicle and feed his own ego, he realized he would have to entirely fabricate the legal justification to do so. Switching off his blinding light, the deputy leaned further into the vehicle and took an exaggerated theatrical breath. The federal agent recognized the physical pantomime instantly, and a cold wave of realization washed over him. He knew exactly which devastating lie was about to be deployed. With a triumphant smirk, the patrolman announced that he detected the distinct, unmistakable aroma of illegal narcotics emanating from the cabin. It is the most notorious subjective loophole in modern enforcement. It cannot be disproven by a microphone or a camera lens, and it is frequently utilized as a completely manufactured bypass of the Fourth Amendment. For the first time, the driver slowly turned his head and locked his gaze directly onto the deputy. The intensity behind his eyes was so profoundly analytical that the patrolman instinctively retreated a fraction of an inch. The agent was no longer viewing a fellow civil servant. He was observing an individual actively committing a severe civil rights violation under the color of law. Without raising his voice or breaking visual contact, the driver elevated his chin slightly, ensuring the audio recording equipment on the officer's chest captured every single syllable. He stated with absolute unyielding clarity that there were 0 illicit substances within the vehicle, and he fundamentally denied consent for any search of his property. The patrolman scoffed, a harsh sound of misplaced confidence. He genuinely believed he had secured the ultimate upper hand. He possessed the magic phrase that granted him unchecked dominion. He arrogantly informed the driver that permission was irrelevant, declaring that the fabricated odor provided absolute probable cause. He issued a rigid command for the driver to unfasten his restraint, open the door, and exit the vehicle. Supreme Court precedent does technically allow an officer to order an occupant out of a vehicle during a lawful stop. However, utilizing a completely invented pretense to extend a detention and bypass the Constitution is a catastrophic legal failure. The agent knew the statutes flawlessly, but he also understood that arguing against a badge and a firearm in the dark was a fool's errand. He moved with graceful compliance, stepping out into the humid night air. Standing on the asphalt, the agent's physical presence was significantly more imposing than the patrolman had anticipated. A sudden spike of insecurity flooded the deputy's mind, prompting an immediate and unnecessary escalation of force. He aggressively ordered the driver to turn around and surrender his hands. The agent silently obeyed, interlacing his fingers behind his back. The patrolman roughly seized his wrists, elevating his arms to inflict a sharp, intentional flare of discomfort before clamping the heavy steel restraints down tight. The metallic clicking echoed loudly in the quiet night. Announcing that the driver was officially detained, the deputy conducted a frantic, aggressive search of the agent's pockets, discovering nothing more than a plastic room key and a mobile device. Grabbing his captive by the arm, the patrolman marched him toward the front of the cruiser, positioning him forcefully, illuminated by the headlights and perfectly framed within the unblinking view of the dashboard camera. He pointed a rigid finger, demanding the agent remain entirely motionless. The agent simply agreed. His expression remained a mask of stone, but internally a master chess player was quietly watching his opponent sacrifice his queen. By placing a senior federal official in physical restraints based on a provable falsehood, the deputy had just vaulted over the line into felony territory. Eager to validate his assumptions, the patrolman rushed back to the pristine pickup truck. Bathed in the strobing emergency lights, the restrained agent stood with magnificent dignity, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He allowed the camera to document his flawless, non-threatening demeanor, building an unbreakable evidentiary foundation for the storm that was about to arrive. Meanwhile, the deputy was ransacking the cabin. Driven by adrenaline and a desperate need to be proven right, he tore through the compartments, scattering charging cords and personal items. He scoured the floorboards and the glove box. There was no currency, there was no contraband, there was absolutely no lingering scent of anything illegal. A suffocating frustration began to fracture his confident facade. The manufactured evidence was failing to materialize. In a frantic bid to justify the restraints he had just deployed, he threw open the rear passenger door. Resting heavily on the back seat was a fortified, waterproof security case. The patrolman's eyes widened. To an aggressive officer running on blind assumptions, a locked, reinforced container in a transient vehicle looked exactly like a vault for illicit materials. The container was secured with a massive, heavy-duty padlock. Legally, breaking into a secured secondary container requires an independent warrant in almost all circumstances, regardless of the initial justification. But the deputy was drowning in his own narrative. He retrieved a heavy steel leverage tool from his belt, wedged it brutally into the lock mechanism, and applied his full body weight. With a violent metallic fracture, the lock gave way. He discarded the broken steel, unlatched the heavy plastic seals, and threw open the lid, directing his blinding flashlight into the interior. He braced himself for bundles of cash or illegal inventory. Instead, the beam illuminated a block of precisely engineered impact foam. Cradled immaculately within the custom cutouts was a matte black, federally issued sidearm. Adjacent to the weapon sat a thick, sealed document folder, bearing a stark crimson classification warning from the Department of Defense. And resting perfectly in the center was a thick, authentic leather credential wallet. The atmosphere inside the truck seemed to instantly freeze. A paralyzing, icy dread began to cascade down the patrolman's spine. The hands that had been tearing through the vehicle just moments prior began to visibly tremor. He reached out with terrifying hesitation and flipped the leather cover open. The harsh light reflected off a magnificent solid gold shield. It was not a municipal badge, it was the undeniable, globally recognized crest of a premier federal investigative command. Beneath the eagle, the engraved enamel proudly displayed the title of Special Agent. Attached to the adjacent panel was a high-security identification matrix. The photograph perfectly matched the man currently standing in steel restraints in front of the cruiser. The rank indicated he was a major. The patrolman's respiratory system seemed to shut down. The heavy flashlight slipped through his perspiring grip, the beam dancing erratically across the interior. His reality fractured as the catastrophic magnitude of his actions crashed down upon him. The individual he had aggressively profiled, unlawfully detained, and physically restrained on the side of a dirt road was not a criminal element. He was a senior federal authority whose entire existence was dedicated to prosecuting the exact type of corruption the deputy had just engaged in. The phantom odor was instantly rendered meaningless. The legal shield of probable cause shattered into dust. By forcing that lock, the officer had cemented a blatant, indefensible violation of federal civil rights, and he had orchestrated the entire disaster while his own recording equipment captured every agonizing second. With trembling fingers, he gently closed the lid of the case, unable to even manage securing the plastic latches. He slowly backed out of the vehicle, pushing the door closed as if he were handling highly volatile explosives. He turned toward the front of his cruiser. The federal agent was still standing precisely where he had been placed, staring directly into the lens of the camera. He had not moved a muscle. He had already won the war. The deputy dragged his boots across the asphalt, the arrogant swagger entirely evaporated. He looked like a man walking toward a sheer cliff. Stopping a few feet from the major, he fumbled for his small metal key, forcing a sickeningly desperate smile onto his face. He attempted to deploy a pathetic, stuttering excuse, claiming there had been a slight misunderstanding, and offered to remove the restraints and issue a simple warning so they could both go on their way. "Do not touch these restraints," the major commanded. He did not elevate his volume. He did not shout. But the absolute crushing authority radiating from his baritone voice caused the patrolman to freeze in sheer terror. "You do not possess my consent to alter this scene," the agent stated, his eyes piercing through the deputy's soul. He systematically dismantled the officer's actions, allowed for the microphone, detailing the fabricated detention, the ignored denial of consent, and the unlawful destruction of federal property. The deputy swallowed dryly, the color entirely draining from his face, pleading that he was simply performing his duties. The major corrected him with surgical precision, stating it was a deliberate choice. He then issued a non-negotiable directive: step back and summon a commanding officer to the location immediately. The ensuing 15 minutes were a masterclass in psychological torture for the patrolman. He paced frantically in the dirt, completely unable to make eye contact with the man whose constitutional rights he had just trampled. Finally, a command vehicle arrived, and a seasoned lieutenant stepped into the humid night. He surveyed the disastrous scene, his pale, hyperventilating subordinate and a sharply dressed, utterly composed federal investigator locked in steel. Before the panicked deputy could construct a defense, the major spoke, his voice cutting clearly over the highway ambiance. He introduced himself formally, outlining the pretextual stop, the unlawful detention, and the forced entry into a classified container, all against explicit recorded directives. The lieutenant halted, absorbing the flawless legal terminology and the undeniable weight of the federal title. He snapped his gaze to his subordinate. The sheer, unadulterated terror in the patrolman's eyes validated every single syllable the agent had spoken. The supervisor asked quietly if the deputy had forced a locked container. The patrolman could only manage a pathetic, silent nod. Realizing his department was staring down the barrel of a catastrophic federal inquiry, the lieutenant rushed forward, apologizing profusely while hastily unlocking the steel bracelets, insisting this behavior did not reflect their agency. The major slowly brought his arms forward, rolling his shoulders to restore circulation. He did not yell, nor did he display an ounce of vindictive anger. He simply delivered the final procedural checkmate. "Apologies do not rectify constitutional breaches," the major replied with chilling smoothness. He formally demanded the preservation of all digital recordings from the interaction, calmly informing the supervisor that the Department of Justice would be initiating contact at dawn to collect the evidence and file severe federal grievances. Without waiting for a response, the major adjusted his collar, turned his back on the men, and returned to his vehicle. He started the engine, smoothly merging back into the darkness of the highway, leaving the devastated deputy standing in the dust, fully realizing he had just sacrificed his entire livelihood for a fabricated technicality. There is a profound lesson here. True authority does not require intimidation, and the Constitution is not a suggestion you can casually ignore when you feel like fishing for a bust. When you let bias drive your decisions, you will inevitably drive yourself right off a cliff. What is your take on this incredible display of composure? Do you believe the deputy should be permanently stripped of his law enforcement credentials, or is there room for rehabilitation after a mistake of this magnitude? I want to read your deepest thoughts on this, so drop your verdict down in the comments. If you appreciate seeing constitutional rights fiercely defended and arrogant overreach shut down, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for the next breakdown on your screen right now. Stay safe and know your rights.